Thank you all for coming to my talk. This is intimidating, but really awesome too. so, was just where I'm going to talk about my NDEs and the after effects and what I'm doing about them now. I have to say that the very first time I ever talked about my experience was at an IONS meeting at Robert and Suzanne Mays' home in North Carolina. And I had gone there to work with them as they were researchers looking at my after effects, and I was not expecting to talk about my experience with anyone. And it turned out at the meeting, I was asked, do you want to go to an IONS meeting? And I said, sure. And then they said, well, great, because you're talking. But it was a great experience. It was really positive. I think it underlines the importance of this organization, that it gives a voice to us. If I hadn't talked at that IONS meeting, I would have never told my husband. And I love him dearly, but it's easier to talk to strangers about these experiences than it is to talk to people who, if they rejected you and your experience, you just couldn't survive it. So I'm very, very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. So first off, first part of my talk is about my NDEs, and I've had 3 of them. My very first NDE happened when I was just a toddler, and that's me talking to my imaginary friends on the telephone. It was not a really complicated experience. It's funny, I was at the talk yesterday where PMH talks about how children relate these NDEs, and I was like, oh geez, yeah, other people have done this just like me. The experience happened when my parents had company over, and I was a little girl who was supposed to be too young to be able to unlock the basement door, where my pet dog, who I loved very much, was kept out of the way of all the company we had over. And being a rather precocious little girl, I got that door unlocked and was playing with my rather large dog on the stairway. And needless to say, a toddler and a large dog on a basement staircase, I took a header down the staircase, and I still have a little scar right here where I cracked my head open. What I have to say is when I had this experience, it was almost like there was little me, who, little toddler me, and how I saw the world, but I was also aware that there was this much bigger me. And at that time, I really didn't think too much about it. It just seemed like, okay, this is how it is. But looking back, it's quite extraordinary that there were these sort of 2 senses of how I kind of fit into the universe. And what I remember most about that experience was it was like being hugged. And when I fell down the stairs, there was no pain. All I remember was this lady picking me up and holding me, and I felt really loved. And the light was kind of dark and sparkly and like purples and blues, and it was just like this warm hug that made me feel really, really safe. And I didn't know who the lady was, but I really liked her. And I just kind of felt like, everything was okay. And it wasn't until years later that I actually saw a picture of her. She was my grandmother, and she had died just before I was born. And there were no pictures of her in the house because my grandfather was just heartbroken when she died, and he couldn't see pictures of her without getting upset. And so there weren't any around the house. And it wasn't until years later when I saw her, and that's my lady. And it was my grandma. But getting back to the sort of little me and the big me, the little me kind of was happy to be safe and warm and loved and all that. But I really just wanted my dad. And I mean that, maybe my higher consciousness self might have thought otherwise, but little toddler me just wanted dad. I wanted to see dad. Where's dad? And that's the next thing I remember is my dad holding me. And the lady wasn't there anymore and I was back. Now, my second NDE happened when I was 10 years old and my appendix burst. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'll be doing a discussion group on distressing NDEs tomorrow, so I can get into more of the details about it then. I guess I'll give you a quick rundown. I mean, that's me in the hospital bed there. It's from a Polaroid that my mom took. And right beside it is one of the many letters. My classmates were all forced by the teacher to write me a get well letter. And, and there many of them are absolutely hilarious. 10-year-olds are really, really funny people. And this one from my friend Janet said, I'm very sorry about your appendix. We all like you. I don't think your appendix did. Unfortunately, yeah, my appendix didn't really hold me in the same esteem that my classmates did. And in that NDE, it was a situation where my parents had no idea how sick I was that morning. It was a Monday morning. I'd been my normal, naughty little 10-year-old self, tormenting my brothers and just having a grand old time over the weekend. And so on Monday morning, when I said I had a tummy ache, nobody believed me. And particularly my brother, who thought it was a terrible injustice that I not have to go to school that day. So what ended up happening was my parents took me to the family doctor, who immediately saw that I was in very bad shape, and they put me in an ambulance right away, and I was in surgery almost as soon as I got to the hospital. And at the time, I remember kind of getting sucked in and out of my body like a straw. And when I was inside myself, it would just hurt like the worst. I mean, it was horrible. And then I'd kind of pop out of myself and I would get some relief from the matter. And again, I don't have time tonight or today to talk about, the entire thing, but I can tell you that part of what made that NDE so distressing was, again, I had this sense of my 10-year-old me versus this kind of larger self who had a lot more knowledge than I did. And I wasn't entirely comfortable with all that extra knowledge about things. And one of the things I found very distressing as a 10-year-old who thought boys were kind of cootie-infested scum was seeing, my future relationships in life. And I thought that was a sure sign that all adults went through this terrible cognitive breakdown. It just, why would people be this way? And another part of what I found very distressing was that when my body was in the operating room being fixed up by the doctors, I had kind of gone looking for my parents because that was all I wanted. Was I just want mom and dad to fix this. That's all I could think of. And I found mom and dad arguing in the waiting room about what they had done wrong, what they could have done differently. And I had never seen my parents fight before. And it was incredibly distressing. And to this day, they won't talk to me about that day that I was in the hospital. Like, they completely just refuse. But it was the first time I ever saw them go through that kind of a fight as a couple. And if when you're little and you think your parents are perfect and your family is perfect, and there's no way that mom and dad would never not be together. And for that brief time, I got the understanding that, yeah, sometimes couples break up, and sometimes people don't get back together. And that was one of the things about the NDE when I had kind of a greater knowledge about what was going to happen in the future, is I saw that there were two choices. And I saw that if I had died, the family situation for my parents would not have been very good. That they would not have stayed together had I died. And that's very common among parents of children who have passed on, that marriages don't usually survive that kind of a trauma. And that was my sense of, if I had died, they were not going to stay together. And I saw all these terrible things happening where, you know, my dad dies alone and heartbroken, and my brothers didn't survive into adulthood. And, you know, my mom had just a series of terrible failed relationships. And it seemed like this huge burden on me, that if I'd gone into the light, which I kind of wanted to do, that I might not have come back and might not have, you know, saved the situation for my family. And I saw kind of a second possibility where I did go back into my body, and I was okay. And my parents were okay, and my brothers were okay. And I can tell you right now, my parents have been married 56 years. This past, I think 2 weeks ago, they celebrated that anniversary. And they've been together since they were children. They've known each other and grown up in the same neighborhood since they were very small. And it's hard to imagine one of them without the other one there. And you know, I mean, maybe it isn't me. Maybe things would have been worked out fine either way, but it's kind of nice that they're together, and that I sort of feel like maybe I did make a good decision when I was 10 years old and didn't go into the light, and, you know. But there were many aspects of this that were very distressing in terms of the responsibility. There were terrorizing aspects about the whole experience, because I wasn't a very cooperative, discarnate individual. You know, I was fighting the whole way as to what to do. But in the end, I think that despite the fact that this was a very distressing experience, I think that it was important for me to go through it, because in many ways it grounded me for my future life and made it possible for me to have a very normal life, whereas my first experience kind of left me very flaky, you know, artistic and lovable, but maybe not well suited for the kind of life that I ended up leading. Now, when I was 29 years old, I had another NDE, and this one was a result of a head-on collision at highway speeds. Now, that's the truck that I hit, and in that picture, I'm actually underneath that truck. My car is underneath that truck. And I know that when I talk about my near-death experience, most people, that's the image that they kind of think about. They think about your injuries, and they think about how your car was sheared in half on black ice on the highway, but I don't remember any of that. And that's not how I think about the experience at all, because for me, that was not the experience. And in fact, this is probably the image that comes to mind when I think about my NDE at the age of 29. This experience happened on a beautiful, beautiful day in the Canadian prairies, where the temperature had just dropped slightly below freezing in January. Now, I know to an audience from California, that probably doesn't really sound all that great. But I can tell you, having grown up in a very cold part of the world, and I love winter. I mean, I love the snow, and I enjoy the outdoors, and I enjoy the wilderness places in Canada. That a day in January where it's slightly above freezing is absolute paradise. And at that time in my life, I was working, actually kind of had a dual existence. I had a job with the Canadian Forces, where I was a drum instructor for a Canadian Forces Highland pipe band. So I was a musician in the military, has part of my existence, and then the rest of my time, I was a landscape painter. And on this day, I had chosen to drive into a provincial park because it was beautiful and warm, and I had taken my little dog Cassie, that's who you see there, and we had gone to paint the landscape out in Spruce Woods Provincial Park, and it was beautiful. Um, if you have to choose a last day on Earth, that would have been an absolutely perfect last day on Earth. I mean, I was sitting beside a frozen lake with my little dog, sipping hot chocolate and painting the landscape. It was just amazing, and it's one of the best days I can remember. Sorry, I got emotional talking about that. So after we had our great day in the park, Cassie and I headed home in my little Hyundai Excel. And as you probably figured out from the previous photograph, we lost control of the vehicle on black ice and pretty much sheared the car in half when we hit the large truck. There's pieces of it on either side of the highway. One of the things that's kind of interesting to me is that some of the newspaper accounts make it sound like I may have been conscious when they originally got me out of the vehicle, and that I had succumbed to the head injuries afterwards and was unconscious for the next couple of days. So it's really, I have no memory of the accident, and that's quite common when you've had a head injury, is that you'll lose roughly 20 minutes preceding the injury itself, and you don't get that back. And it's sort of strange when you think about consciousness, is that for how everybody normally thinks about consciousness, I was conscious and awake and talking even though I have no memories, and I was not capable of forming memories. And for me, that doesn't seem like consciousness at all. And then once I got into the NDE experience, that was where it seemed like I was very conscious. And yet to anyone in this existence, that's when I was gone. The first thing that I remember, because I don't remember the accident, but I remember being in the balcony of this building that was in the middle of the wilderness, and I could see my little dog Cassie playing in the meadow just below me, and I wanted so badly to go down there where she was. And she was barking at me, kind of telling me, come down here and play with me, and, come on, we need to get going. This place is awesome. And, and I agreed with her, it was awesome, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to get down to where she was. And then when I was thinking about how I was going to get down there, my grandmother, who happened to be there, my deceased grandmother, wouldn't let me go. Now, this wasn't the grandmother that I saw in my first NDE. This was my paternal grandmother, who I'd grown up with and been very, very close with for, that part of my life. She'd actually died just shortly before this experience. And, my grandmother was there, and she kept telling me, don't worry, I'm going to get you through this. And at the time, I didn't know what I was supposed to be getting through. I mean, because where I was absolutely awesome. It was great. How can I be needing to get through anything? This is just the most wonderful place and the most wonderful experience. And I feel incredibly loved. And this is great. So what is there that I need to be getting through? And I didn't really have a concept of back here at that point. I was just where I was, and everything was great.
What did it look like?
To me, it looked like a wilderness area. It looked a lot like the place where I had spent just that phenomenal day. The difference was instead of just it being wintertime, it wasn't just January. It was like all the seasons seemed to be represented at once. I mean, I could smell snow and I could smell flowers, and like you don't just see or smell or hear independently, all your senses kind of get mixed together. And it seems like it really shouldn't make sense that way, but it made way more sense that way. It just seemed like there was this really pure information that it just, everything was all together mishmashed, but it made sense. And it was far more precise and clear. I mean, what happens here is so murky and muddy by comparison. What I experienced there was just amazingly clear. Um, and the information was just absolutely pure. Um, and I mean, I'm really, I know when people want to know a description, and it's very difficult to find the appropriate language to convey all of this because there really isn't any kind of language that works. And I've tried. I mean, I've looked at this every way possible, and there just isn't a way to make it so that it makes sense to people here that haven't experienced it before. But I can say that it was just so much more real than here. And I know you probably heard that. Like, that's kind of the comment the near-deathers will make. It's realer than real. But it was. And if I had better words, I'd use them, honest. Because, I really want you to understand. But I should probably get. So there's a lot of other things to cover. Like I said, I understand. If you want to talk to me more about the NDEs, I'm certainly willing to, and I'll be talking a lot about the distressing one in the discussion group tomorrow. But you can ask me questions about any of these. I know that it's a lot for an hour-long presentation, especially when there's 3 of them, and I could write a book on every one or an encyclopedia on every one. There's just so much there. So I'm going to talk about the after effects. And I think anyone who went to PMH's talk, I certainly recognized a lot of myself in what she's had to say about after effects. And yes, that's my hand with the butterfly. For some reason, I have a weird butterfly thing where they all latch onto me all the time. and people have joked, well, maybe that's an end-of-year thing, but I don't think that's been documented in any of the literature. So the after effects of my first experience as a child were actually pretty pleasant. I think when you're little and a little bit different, that's okay. It's actually very cute. Now, these are comments from my early report cards. And in fact, Follows Her Own Personal Drummer, that was from my very first report card in kindergarten. My teachers early on thought I was very imaginative and I was a popular playmate and creative. And there's really no downside to being a little bit different at that age. It was okay. But unfortunately, once you get a little bit older, things change in perspective as far as your teachers go. And, I went from being creative and imaginative to Shirley seems to be in another world at times. And that wasn't really such a popular thing for them to write. And it was constant. I mean, this was repeated over and over again for my report cards throughout elementary school, is that she's just not here. So, my main after effects has a child. We're looking at precognitive experiences and imaginary friends. Now, I mean, I think a lot of children do have, imaginary friends that aren't really imaginary friends. Throughout my childhood, I saw the grandmother from the first NDE quite a lot. And I continued to see her until my grandfather passed away, and then I kind of saw them go off together, which was quite sweet. And I also had precognitive experiences. Now, my father's favorite childhood story about me, it's a Christmas story where apparently when I was just at the age where a lot of kids are starting to, wonder if Santa's real. Well, I had older brothers, and I was the youngest of three, and my brothers were told that under no circumstances were they supposed to disillusion me about Santa Claus that year, that my parents wanted one last, yay, Santa's coming Christmas, before I got to the point where I was too old and might not be quite so believing. And the only problem with my parents' grand scheme for that was the fact that I wanted, well, I didn't want, I knew what Santa was bringing me. And I described it lovingly. It was a porcelain tea set with blue flowers. And I described this in loving detail. And I wrote a wonderful letter to Santa Claus, thanking him in advance for the fact that he was going to get me this tea set. Now, the problem was my parents couldn't find this thing anywhere. They looked and they looked and they looked. This tea set did not exist. And I mean, back then, you got everything out of the Sears catalog, the Christmas wish book, and they could not find this. And they looked and they looked and they were just beside themselves. And, it was to the point where they were trying to explain to me, well, sometimes Santa Claus can't always bring you exactly what you want, but, try and go with it. and I was, I wouldn't hear of it. It's like, no, Santa knows what I want. This is not a problem. Santa has got this covered. Well, my dad, at the company he worked for, they had Christmas parties every year where the kids would go and sit on Santa's knee and get a present. And it just so happened that year when I sat on Santa's knee, he handed me my porcelain tea set with blue flowers. Now, now I remember looking at my parents and going, what was the problem? Like, why were you people so concerned? Santa had this covered. I've been telling you this all along. He handed it to me himself. And after that experience, I don't think there was a Santa skeptic in our house for years, because but that was what I was like as a little kid. I mean, there's various things where I would come up with and saying this was going to happen, and and it did. Now, after my distressing NDE, things were a little bit more challenging. One of the bigger issues that I had to deal with was feeling overwhelmed by too much information. And so school was a real nightmare for me. And a lot of the time I would basically find ways to get myself expelled, just so that I wouldn't have to deal with being in the classroom. As I got older and got into university, alcohol was a great help throughout my college years. But, when you're little, you can't do that. So you have to get yourself in trouble. Another thing I had to deal with were OBEs. Now, I didn't know what an out-of-body experience was. And it was quite frightening for me. And part of the reason that I was so afraid was that, having had a distressing NDE, I didn't want to go anyplace bad again. I didn't want to be stuck out of my body and have something bad happen to my family while I was gone. Like, I just didn't understand what was going on, and it was very scary for me. And another thing that I dealt with at this time were my first memories of RSPK. Now, for those who don't know, RSPK stands for, now I'm going to forget, but recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, which is basically poltergeist activity. It was set off when I was 11 years old. It was in the year after my distressing NDE. Now, after this NDE, I was having OBEs and nightmares at night, and I had gotten to the point where I was trying to hide in the closet at night and stay awake all night to avoid having these experiences, because I tried to explain them to my parents, and my parents didn't understand what was going on. And so what ended up happening was that I'd be one very tired child in school the next day, because I'd be hiding in my closet awake all night, and then I'd go to school and just pass out in front of the teacher, and which would get me into trouble. And on one instance where I had been having these issues with the teacher, and the teacher didn't like the fact that I wasn't paying attention to her, and I'd gone to guidance counselors, and they had suggested maybe if I had a sketchbook, that when I was feeling overwhelmed in the classroom, if I could just sit and quietly draw pictures in the corner, that that might help me out. Well, this teacher didn't really agree with what the guidance counselors were telling me to do, and has an 11-year-old sitting in a classroom drawing in my little sketchbook, trying to calm myself down so I could be around all of these overwhelming situations where just too many people, too much noise, too much going on. The teacher hit me. She smacked me in the face, and she threw my sketchbook across the classroom. And what happened next basically had me branded as the child from hell forever after that in school, because my sketchbook picked itself up and threw itself at the teacher and hit her. And that was my first experience of poltergeist activity. And of course, none of the adults would talk about what had happened. They all started lying about it. No, because that's crazy. Books don't pick themselves up and throw themselves at teachers. And I mean, I almost even started believing them because I didn't know what to do. I knew that if I told the truth, I'd be in trouble. But then I knew I wasn't really supposed to lie, that lying wasn't appropriate either. So I became a rather wild teenager as a result of this, because I really lost a lot of respect for authority, because I had to learn to lie about my experiences. And one of the next things that happened to me brought me back to my distressing NDE, where I was concerned that once you became an adult, you were going to lose all cognitive function, was I started seeing colored lights around people. And where they were brightest were the boys I was the most attracted to. Even my husband, he laughs about the fact that I told him that he was like the brightest light in the room when we met, and I just couldn't I couldn't not talk to him. And which was funny because we were both in the military at the time, and he was an officer, and I had a terrible dislike for officers being enlisted. But yeah, it didn't keep us apart very well. Now, as an adult, after my third NDE, there was a real revival and intensification of these experiences. I have to tell you that as much as I was a wild teenager, and I mean, I did all the bad things that any teenager could think of doing, and it made it worse that I was in university at 17. So I had access to all kinds of fun things, that, when back then, they'd hand you a beer on your way to class when you were in college, and that's, I did all the bad things one could do, and I probably am lucky that I survived my teenage years. But then I grew up and I calmed down and I got married and led a very, very normal life for a while. And a lot of these experiences really calmed down. Through my 20s, every so often I would have an unusual experience. When my grandmother passed away, I did see her, and things like that did occur every so often. But it wasn't the focus of my life. My family and my husband and my job and those things were my focus, as they should be, because I think when I'm here and when we're all here, that should be the focus of what we're here to do. But after my car accident at 29, suddenly everything just popped up again. And there was particularly a lot of issues with the RSPK. There was electronic malfunctions, which, a lot of NDers have issues with electronics. Recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. So there was also, movement of objects, unusual lights that were experienced, not just by myself, but by other people. So it wasn't just me seeing auras. There was anomalous lights showing up. And a big thing that I had to come to terms with was that I needed to understand these different things that were going on, and I wanted to learn, more about them. Now, one thing I have to explain to you, it's not uncommon for people to have personality changes after a near-death experience. At least that's what I've been told. Now, before my car accident, As I explained, I made my living as a musician and an artist. After my car accident, I went back to university and did a graduate level education in science. And I'll often tell people that if you take an artist and hit them really hard, they'll learn math. I mean, suddenly I was getting excited about algorithms, and seriously, that's just wrong. But because of this, I'd gone back to university and I learned about science, and I wanted to understand these experiences. And it was really very difficult to find out about the literature. Not very many people are aware that there's a huge body of literature on parapsychological research, but it takes a while to figure out where it is and how to find it. So now we get to the point about what am I doing about this now? Well, I've been involved as a research participant at a number of different universities. The very first experience for me was with Michael Persinger and William Roll in a study done at Laurentian University. And I went back to Laurentian University later that year. And then after that, I did some work with Robert and Suzanne Mays, and they'll be speaking right after me, at the Rhine Research Center in North Carolina. And, I've been to a variety of other places, but I have to tell you that it's great to be able to work with other researchers, but you have to understand that usually it's for such a limited period of time. Because if you fly across the country, you spend 3 days in the lab, you hope that things work out, and then you fly home, and then you spend the next 6 months crunching the numbers to see what actually occurred while you were there. So eventually I had to realize I did my own work as well, because it's nice to be able to do long-term studies on this. This is from my first trip to Laurentian University. And for anyone who knows anything about EEGs, there's not that many channels on the EEG. They're hooking me up into that picture, and I'm just pointing it out because later on you're going to see the one that was used by the University of Virginia's DOPS laboratory, and they have a much more sophisticated setup. The fellow that I'm with there is William G. Roll, and for anyone who's familiar with parapsychology, he's basically the guy that wrote a lot of the early literature and coined the phrase RSPK and did a lot of the early work on poltergeist activity, and started to relate it to people as opposed to spirits and ghosts, that it's really a function of consciousness rather than something that's happening to us from outside sources. I've also done some work with Dr. Norm Hansen. He's a professor emeritus at University of Maryland. And that thing that's above my head, it's actually measuring a bioenergy field. And he's recently published a few papers on this. He hasn't published the work that we did together yet, but I think this is really exciting for NDEers, the fact that somebody is actually finding ways to measure that we might be a little bit different just in our energy, because we all kind of know that there's something different about us. And Norm's actually figured out a way to take some measurements. And what was really, really interesting for me when I was in his lab, I actually had an OBE at one point while I was sitting under that little thing that measures the energy. And whatever it is that's measured, when I was out of body and I could see the little feedback screen, it flattened right out. So I thought that was pretty cool, that when nobody was home, the machine wasn't measuring very much. Whoops. Whereas when I was in there and active, it was a very, very productive machine. It was a cool experiment. I was really happy that I got a chance to work with him.
Were you awake?
Yes, I was awake. So in May of this year, I actually was fortunate enough to get to visit University of Virginia's Department of Perceptual Studies. And these two pictures kind of give you a sense of what was going on. In one room, the kids were playing with the toys. So there's Ross Dunseith and the lab tech guy, I can't remember his name right now, hooking me up to their EEG montage, which has many more channels than the one that that was used when I was at Laurentian University. And in the other room, all the grown-ups were having adult conversations. And you see Eben Alexander was there, and Ed Kelly, and Karen Newell, and Suzanne Mays, and Bruce Grayson kept running in and out of the lab and laughing at me. Um, but it was a really interesting experience. One of the side things that I didn't realize at the time that I was there was I couldn't understand why Eben Alexander was so interested in meeting me, because I really didn't know him. But I've been doing some work with Karen Newell, is one of the founders of a company called Sacred Acoustics that does binaural beat recordings for meditation. And they had asked if I was interested in being a test subject for some of their material. And I was thrilled that, somebody was helping me. They actually came up with some custom-made recordings for me to use in research work. But early on in that, I had tested one of the recordings for sleep. Now, I still suffer from nightmares at times. And when I did go through and listen to this recording that's supposed to help you have more pleasant dreams, I ended up having an amazing lucid dream about this deceased person who I had never met before. And so I wrote about it in this log, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to listen to the recordings and write down whatever experience you have from them. So I, gave this experience about this fellow named Bob who came to me and talked to me about his death, and we kind of compared notes, what a near death was like compared to a real death. And I had written all this down, and then I got an email back from Karen asking me for more details. And I thought, okay, I thought I was pretty detailed, but okay, I'll write some more information down. So I wrote as much down as I could remember. It turned out that everybody who had access to that log, including Dr. Alexander, knew who Bob was. Now, I'd never met the man, but it turned out that quite a number of the researchers that I've met and worked with were good friends. His name is Bob Vandercastle, and eventually they put me in contact with Bob's partner so that I could talk to her, and she was actually really gracious enough to talk to me and confirm a lot of the stuff that I had written down in this log. So I was, it was nice to get that kind of feedback on things. But has it turned out that this man had actually helped Eben with the first draft of Proof of Heaven, and they were quite good friends. And so that's why Eben was suddenly so interested, because I had no idea. I thought, wow, it's really nice that Eben Alexander wants to meet me. And so that's why he was there that day. I had no clue why he was being so nice to me, because I'm actually quite afraid of doctors. And I was almost telling him, like, stop opening doors for me. Stop being nice to me. Doctors shouldn't be nice. Keep your distance. And that wasn't the case at all. He actually was very curious about me for reasons I didn't know. And then finally, this is the Rhine Research Center group I was working with in May. With Robert and Suzanne are there, as well as John Kruth and Graham Watkins. And I can't show you any pictures of what we were doing in the lab for that one, because a lot of it was done in a dark room using a photomultiplier tube, where they measure the number of photons that you're emitting. And the idea is that people who do energy healings and various other things can sometimes produce anomalous amounts of photons. And so apparently I can do that sometimes too. So that was cool. So this brings me to my personal research. Now, having done, having come up with things where there's issues with poltergeist activity, someone had suggested that if I worked with a target device moving it, that maybe it would keep me from moving other things. So what you see here, there's an Egley wheel, which is a commercially available device, and it's actually Dean Radin had suggested I started working with the Egley wheel because it was standardized, and it would be something that I could go to different labs and they would know, how these things work before I got there. The other two were just pinwheel set up inside of jars that I'd been using has my first type of at-home experiments. Now, I think I need some help with the video. Could somebody start? Ah, and then there it goes. Okay, this is basically the kind of thing that I was playing around with to quantify the effects that I was seeing. And so I'd start off by getting the little pinwheel to move without having it in a confined space. Now, that can certainly be affected by convection currents and wind and all sorts of things when it's like that. But once you kind of make a connection to whatever it is you want to move, then you put the lid on and you see if you can still get it going. And hopefully how are we in time? We're good? Okay. just a bit worried that, you know. So there we go. I'm putting the lid on it now. And I have to tell you that education in science, like, I really became a serious nerd. And part of it was that I was recording all of my experiences. If I was seeing a person in a room that no one else saw, I wrote that down. If something moved, I wrote it down. If I blew out a light bulb, which I do, I had a drawer move open from in the hotel room this morning. I had like the drawers opening. Water taps turning on is really common. Lights blinking on and off, that's not unusual. And see, there we go. So it's in the jar. It's reasonably well controlled. I mean, there's still a lot of skeptics that'll say, well, there's ways of cheating, but I've been to professional laboratories where we've done some work controlling as many of the variables as possible, and there still seems to be an effect going on there. And I mean, I get bored when I see this. I know people like it, but it's not, I don't find it that exciting. But when I was doing my own research on this, I basically set this up every night and got it spinning and videotaped it all to see how long it would take me to get it to spin. And prior to doing each experimental run, I did a PANAS mood score so that I could actually quantify my emotional state of being, as well as being able to quantify how quickly I was able to move the wheel. So it was totally nerdy, because really, who does all that? But I have to say I'm glad I did all that, because I was actually able, 2 weeks ago, there was the Parapsychological Association conference in near San Francisco. And although I wasn't able to attend in person, I did have a paper accepted there, and my co-author, Jim Carpenter, who's the president of the Parapsychological Association, was kind enough to present the work for me. So I thought that was pretty cool. So did I learn anything? Well, I'd like to, you know, to start off by saying that I was very pleasantly surprised to learn that there's a hidden wealth of scientific literature on psi phenomena. And certainly many NDEs, you know, have these experiences, and it's unfortunate that mainstream scientists aren't better aware of it. And I think it, you know, at least in my case, it was great to become involved in research. It was great to do my own research. And I would say to people that don't be afraid of this stuff. It's okay to do experiments and play with it. You know, I did a workshop at the Rhine where we all built little pinwheels, and I was amazed at how many people were able to get their pinwheel spinning in their jars. Like, once you see it, it's not uncommon for people who've seen it to just be able to do it. It always amazes me that it quite often works that way. So play with things, and, you know, give yourself permission to be curious, because this stuff is actually pretty cool. But I have to say, the most important thing I learned would be that even though my experiences are unusual, they are perfectly normal human experiences. And it's very unfortunate that society doesn't recognize this. That it's not unusual to see discarnate individuals. It's not unusual for psychokinesis to occur. Precognitive dreams are incredibly common. If anyone wants to find out and they don't have to be as nerdy as me. They can just keep a dream journal, and eventually you're going to find out that you're having precognitive experiences as you sleep. Um, all this stuff is incredibly normal, and it's okay, and it doesn't make you a bad scientist. That was one of the real difficult things I had to overcome, is I thought I was being a bad scientist because I was looking into this, but it's not. It's perfectly fine. Anyway, I've rambled on enough here, so thank you all so much for listening to my talk. And I don't know if, do we have any time left for questions?
Yes, we do.
Ah, so we have time for questions. Yay. Thank you all so much.
Hi. So when you did the Egley wheel, or whatever you call that, was there an explanation that was attributed to the fact of your being able to control? Like, were you generating an electromagnetic field because of you came back changed? You know, what did you guys think about the effect that you were able to produce?
You know, we're still trying to figure out what that effect is. And I kind of think that the work that, I showed Norm Hansen's work with, looks like a colander over the head that's measuring kind of a bioenergy field. And it's not static that he's measuring, because he is actually controlled for static. So electrostatics don't seem to be it, even though it does sometimes mimic that. It's right now, they're just documenting the effect. We still haven't figured out exactly what the effect is. One of the things that we did do a number of times was we grounded everything. I mean, I was grounded, the Egley wheel was grounded, so there was no possibility of static electricity or electrostatics moving that wheel, and it actually moved faster. So, yeah. um,
Two questions about psychokinesis. First, when the book lifted itself up and hit the teacher, did you see that happen?
oh yeah, the whole classroom saw it happen.
How far did the book move?
You do realize this was when I was 10 years old, so that was many, many years ago. But I mean, it came across the classroom. It was, a good distance, probably from that chair to here.
As of now, are you able psychokinetically to move objects?
Well, I'm able to do these small effects, like with the wheel and the jar. I mean, my main concern, being interested in doing research, is that I wanted to produce a small effect that was robust enough to be repeated over and over again. And that's what I've managed to achieve, and it takes a lot of practice. If I'm going to a lab, I would practice every day for at least 3 months prior to getting there, just to get the effect to the point where I could trust it would work, because you never feel as good after you have a plane ride across the country. It's just, you never know, your allergies could act up, you could feel crappy that day. I mean, there's just so many variables. So you want it to work even when you're at your absolute worst. And I've been really fortunate so far that none of the labs I've gone to have been disappointed. That, I mean, I might not have been able to produce the most phenomenal results every time, but we've gotten results that are statistically significant and useful in research. So no, I'm not lifting up chairs in the laboratory, and I'm not, I'm not producing really large effects, but we are getting repeatable, consistent effects, which is what researchers really need.
I don't mean to be facetious, but you should be your goal to go to Las Vegas and try that guy's.
Yeah, see, that's terrible, because actually on our way here, we drove here from Canada, and our car broke down in Vegas and is currently still there, and I'm hoping it will be fixed until we are ready to go home. So maybe I'll be stuck in Vegas when I get there.
So is emotion a component of the ability for PK?
It absolutely seems to be a component. And yes, that was part of what I found by doing the PANAS mood scores and doing a long-term study of my own effects. The biggest difference we found was that there was kind of a before and after. When I was finally able to get the wheel moving inside the jar, because that didn't happen originally. It took about 3 months of sitting down every day and trying to move that wheel inside the jar before it finally started moving inside the jar. And the scores on my emotional state of mind, cumulatively, before I was able to get that to occur versus afterwards, is I was a much happier person afterwards. It's almost as if, well, it might not just be almost as if, it may be as if you have to get yourself in a happy place and be happy with yourself and be accepting of these abilities before they're going to work for you. So yes, being happy. And when I'm angry, you ask my husband what happens when I'm angry. Because we had some interesting effects with electronics on our way here. Yes.
Okay, in the first two NDEs that you had, you said, I think you recalled them like right away, but the third experience, it came back to you in dreams rather than a strict memory, or am I misinterpreting that?
Oh, you're misinterpreting. Actually, my first experience as a toddler, I remembered up until I had the distressing NDE, and then I kind of blotted the both of them out for years and years because I was so upset. And they both came back after my very blissful one when I was 21. When I was 29, I remembered that experience immediately. In fact, I tried to tell doctors immediately, which of course was not a good idea. And so I actually got myself, I tried to tell my Army Padre when it first happened, and his response was to tell me, okay, this is common among soldiers, it's not that unusual experience, but don't talk about it, and I'll find somebody away from the military that you can talk to so that this doesn't get on your permanent record.
Okay, thank you.
Oh.
Did you write a book?
No, I haven't written a book.
The question was, has she written a book? And?
No, I haven't written a book. I have written a scientific paper, and I'm working on some others, and I have actually been I have been working a little bit on a book, but I have no idea what I'm going to do with it.
What's your MOS in the Army?
Sorry?
What's your MOS in the Army?
The question was, what's your MOS in the Army?
Oh, okay. I was a musician in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Say again?
I was a musician in the Canadian Armed Forces. So I was a drum instructor for a Highland Pipe Band. That was my job.
And don't you love that lad?
Yeah.
And yes, I wear kilt to work every day.
We love you even more. And on that note, let's all give her a hand.
Thank you so much.